Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Discussion Bound. Today is November the 10th, a lovely Tuesday, as Judy just told me in the chat. Lovely morning, sunny. And we are happy to have you with us. And I am very happy to have Judy Upjohn, one of our touring docents, on as our co-host and main moderator today. And she chose the book, You Must Change Your Life, the story of Rainer Maria Rilke and Auguste Rodin by Rachel Corbett. Before we get started, just a few notes about the technology. You probably noticed as you were getting logged on that microphones and video were muted by default. We would love to see your lovely face on this lovely day. So please feel free to unmute your video. And in just a moment, I'll make it so that folks can unmute their microphones as well. For your best experience, choose a quiet room and close the door. Please silence any alerts from nearby devices. I'll take my own advice right now. Try not to sit in front of a window, lamp, or other strong light source or source of motion, like a fan if you choose to have on your video. It just makes it a little hard to see you. Use headphones and microphone for best sound quality. While you can log in using a smartphone, we do recommend using a laptop, tablet, or desktop to see slides and meeting tools on a larger screen. Make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last initial or first name and last name so that we know who we're talking to. In order to ask questions or make comments throughout the program, you'll be able to unmute your microphone when Judy or I ask for questions or comments. And for those of you who have attended Discussion Bound before, you know that it can be a pretty free-form conversation. So we would encourage you to just unmute yourself. You can also type any questions that you have into the chat box, and Judy and I will be pausing every now and again to make sure that we haven't missed any comments or questions from there. A third way to participate is to raise your hand in the participant sidebar, and either Judy or I will unmute you, and you can go ahead and make your comment or ask your question. It can take a while sometimes to get to hands though, so please do feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions or make comments. Finally, we are recording, so if you prefer not to be recorded, just leave off your video and microphone and use the chat box for communication. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Judy. Judy, tell us why you chose today's book.
Hi, everybody. Well, I picked up the book because I'm interested in how artists and writers influence each other and how everybody in the arts influence each other. And Rodin, I don't know, since I was in my 20s, was a powerful sculptor to me. And when I was young, I went to his museum in Paris, and I was just blown away by his sculpture of Balzac and some of the others. And Rilke, I don't know as well. I don't know his work as well, but they were both powerful modernist figures that really affected the work that they were doing in their time. So I thought, what could be better than reading about how they met and, you know, what their development was. And I just picked up the book and I started reading it, and I thought, oh my God, this would be great to talk about. So I was thinking, how many of you read some of the book? Okay, so one, two, so there are a few, okay. All right, so you have and you haven't, so there's a mix here. So I don't know how many people really know the work of these two guys. So I was thinking, Christy, maybe what we should do first is show the photographs of the sculptures, and there are a couple little poems here. So you can kind of get a sense. So this is Rodin in the upper left-hand corner. Yep, with his hand on one of his busts, I assume. And Rodin is the next picture too. Those are his torsos. He did large, monumental bronze sculptures and statues, but he also made a lot of small portraits and busts and torsos, and he was always making feet and hands and, you know, sort of separate body parts. Okay, the third from the left is The Thinker. It's one of his famous ones. That's in the, yeah, both of those. The one on the right is a close-up of The Thinker. That's in the Rodin Museum in Paris. And then lower corner on the left, the Bourgeois de Calais, the burghers of Calais. And I don't know if you can, Christy, is there a way to look close up? If not, just look at the next picture and you can see the hand that's reaching up and the extreme tension and almost anguish possibly in that figure. It was very unusual for that time. And he was condemned for not making pretty heroic art. The marble in the middle is The Kiss. It's been sort of talked about as the ultimate of erotic romance, but it's actually from Dante's Inferno. There are two adulterous lovers. And the next one is Balzac. And if I can find a close-up somewhere while we're talking.
I think I've got on the next slide, I've got this one that you sent.
Yeah, okay. So Balzac was a great literary figure in Paris, and Rodin thought, you know, what is a writer really like? He's up in the middle of the night, he's racking his brain because he can't get the sentence right and he doesn't know what to do next, and he's full of these ideas. So he rendered him in his bathrobe with this disheveled hair, looking slightly mad. And the big controversy about this is, where is his other hand? It's underneath his bathrobe, doing what we do not know, as the author of the books. Rodin didn't spare any reality. Okay. You want to go back, Christy, to that? That's the inside of the museum, by the way, on the left. So this one, what is this one called? Does anyone know the name of this? The leaping. It's also a famous image, but
is it called like kneeling man or kneeling boy? I think she brought it up a couple times in the book.
Yes, something like that. It's a famous image, and he did a bunch of them in different versions. And again, here's another one. I don't know the title of. I'm sorry, I don't know all of these. But I just wanted you to be able to see how he would carve these reliefs out of the stone. But then actually in the book, he said, you know, when you're carving a relief, it's the depth. You're going into the depth, it's not the surface you ever pay attention to. So Balzac was, Rodin was big on observation, minute observation, and feeling with his eyes what the contours were doing. Okay, so I'd love to hear your reactions. Like, what do you think about this art? Do you like it? What do you think about it? Penny, you're nodding your head.
Christy, can you go to the other slide that has all this? So I love Rodin, and I believe, Christy, is this correct that there's a sculpture garden at the High Museum that has a lot of Rodin?
I think it's the
Philadelphia Museum of Art.
It's the North Carolina Museum of Art, isn't it?
Okay, thank you, because I know it was something that we visited together. What's amazing to me is the breadth of his work, and my favorite work on this particular slide is the one that's the bottom row, second from the right. I just love the way he captures form and movement, and just amazing. I've just always been blown away by his work.
Is that decapitated? Because he was known, as you said, known for body parts. Is there just the head back? Like, do you know?
There's no head. There's no head on that. which I think makes it all the better. Because
It's
you
like
really,
it's missing the left arm too.
yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, he was all about form. I mean, that was how he saw the world, was form. And there are little collections of Rodin all over the place. Philadelphia does. Joey mentioned Philadelphia. Philadelphia does have a lot of Rodin as well. The Met has some.
Someone bought a bunch of them and they made a little museum there on the Parkway in Philadelphia, and it has quite a few of them in there. And I went there as a kid numerous times, so I always liked his work. To answer your question, and I think they have there must be multiples of these things, or they were cast, because I'm pretty sure they have the Burgers of Calais there. That one.
Yes,
I remember, yeah.
there are multiples all over the place in different sizes too. Just a little odd.
I've always thought of his work as kind of inconsistent because some of it is absolutely photorealistic. It's just, down to every vein and ripple of muscle, just perfectly observed. But whenever I look at the Balzac, I always think it looks very impressionistic and sort of rough. You know that it comes from clay rather than, being formed in an additive sense rather than, being carved in a subtractive sense. It feels like an impression of Balzac, or sort of the feeling that you get when you read Balzac, rather than, a keenly observed representation of the individual, I guess.
I think that's
So,
what I really like about that
yeah.
Balzac. I mean, that's for me what gives it its distinction.
So I guess, I mean, it's not a value judgment. It's just, I think that, there are a lot of things that you can look at that are by Rodin, but um, it it's not as if there's one distinct way that he made everything that he made, if that makes sense.
Is that related to the time that it was done, made? And did he develop more of an impressionistic as in his later works, much like Michelangelo did in his later works?
No, that's a great question, I think, because he did work for a long time, and I don't know the specific dates of these different sculptures, but I know that, in the beginning, he was trying to be accepted by the academy, by the écoles, by, I mean, none of the shows would take his work. And he was accused actually of being, of making plaster casts because his detail was so perfect. The sculptures looked more exact than the actual person in a way. And he took that very hard, that he would cast a person and put that out as a sculpture. And then later on, he still used this close observation method. He was nearsighted. So in the book, it talks about his nose being right up against the clay sometimes. And he would look very, very, very closely at he talked about life and movement and the real profound depth being contained in tiny little gestures. And he shifted around in his work. I mean, he was a laborer in the beginning. He was sculpting to make money, and he was experimenting all the time. It is my impression of him.
That was what I enjoyed about the book, because it really gave a really good insight into his development from being a laborer and being, a young man. And then also that example you gave of him being accused because he went to Italy and he was trying to emulate Michelangelo, and he was criticized for being too perfect. It kind of shows the evolution of his art and the way he viewed it as time went on. I do think it had to do with the time in his life. I think it showed his growth. That's why I'm enjoying the book.
But as far as this Balzac that looked more impressionistic and where he was in, if his style developed, he was very uncomfortable. He was a classic sculptor, which is what I learned from the book. And he was very, he fought against this period of time when abstract and more impressionistic art was starting to become more popular. He continued to do his own thing and never bought into the movement that was going on around him. Is that not correct? That's what I learned from reading about him in this book.
Yeah, what, does anyone else have a comment on that?
Well, that's what, and my video isn't working again today, but this is Billy. That's what I understand. And, you know, this Balzac is, like many of his works, it's an assemblage. He didn't do just one piece. He took pieces and put them together to create a piece. And in the case of Balzac, that's what he did. Just a quick digression from, it kind of fits in with the book that I found very interesting is we tend as, particularly as Americans in this time period, to romanticize Europe, and particularly Europe in the early 20th century in Paris, as it was being beautifully, to our eye, beautifully redesigned. And I enjoyed in the reading the conflict about what, the comments about how Paris was being destroyed. Not unlike what was happening in Beijing when they were tearing down the hutongs, and they've done in Chicago, tearing down the projects. That this redesign and this movement towards modernism, whether it in architecture or sculpture or city design, was very controversial. And we look back on Rodin and these modernist artists of that time from all over Europe and admire their work, but it was highly controversial.
Billy, do you think that, or does anyone, do you think that Rodin was, to what extent was he responding to his environment, and to what extent was he making statements about his environment? Was he political at all in his work? Was he just doing the work that he wanted to do sort of in his bubble? What do you think about that?
I do have a date for the Balzac, and it's 1892 to 1897, and that's right in the height of the Impressionists.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I thought he was working in his own bubble. I thought that was what Rachel Corbett made a big point of, that regardless of what was going on around him, he continued to follow his own desires and his own path. In answer to your question, Judy, previous question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that he was conflicted between who he was and what he wanted to do and what he had to do to survive, which is not unusual for many artists. And the conformity that, you know, the salons and what was going on in the Parisian art world at that time was, I mean, that's the height of the Impressionists, but the Impressionists weren't particularly revered or respected at that time. So it was a emerging style of painting and art. So I personally think, and I'm not a Rodin scholar by any means, but in all the work and what I have read about him, he sought to be his own man, and he succeeded.
Right.
That doesn't mean that he wasn't a part of the movement, though, that it might have been happening around him. And the Burghers of Calais fit into that same textural feeling, and that certainly fits in who he, I mean, that idea, the nose to the surface and feeling the surface was very important to him. And that comes through in both the Balzac and the Burghers of Calais, which would be very about impressionistic thinking. Fit right into that way of thinking.
Tim Lewis is chatting in the panel. Tim, can you unmute yourself?
Tim's
No.
microphone and video don't work, so that's why he's typing in the box.
Oh, that's too bad. I wanted to ask because Tim is an artist, I think. Is that?
Tim's a photographer.
Yeah, photographer. So I wanted you to sort of get in on this idea of how, you know, sometimes we think that an artist is intentional in what they're doing. If they're trying to be provocative, if they're trying to comment on something going on in their environment or society, sometimes we see that in their work, but it just happens because of who the artist is and where they are in their development at that particular time. And I wanted to ask Tim if he could comment on that, but maybe you can type something, we'll read it later. Does anyone else have a comment? I'm thinking we should go to Rilke and then we can talk about both of them. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to leave you stranded with Rodin with a burning question. Oh, Joey just said Rodin was a master of publicity. Really?
I mean,
yeah,
he seemed to know how to turn negative publicity into, you know, fame. And you know, as opposed to working in a bubble, I think he did it on purpose. He did some of these things on purpose to get attention, and he got it. He won out on a lot of those controversies of whether they should install his sculpture or not. And at the end of the day, he did prevail.
He did prevail at the end, that's for sure. But I also have the impression that he was really pretty devastated by this accusation of his fraudulence as a sculptor, that he was making plaster casts.
Well, he had, I mean, I don't know if anybody else got this impression, but I got the impression that he kind of had a chip on his shoulder because he didn't have the same artistic training and the same, you know, art schools that a lot of his other famous contemporaries did. And he went through more sort of the trade school route, and he was rejected and rejected and rejected and rejected by the salon, and kind of, you know, had his vengeance by being commercially successful towards the end of his life. But I feel like he just probably felt like he had more to prove than everyone else because he didn't have, you know, the same background and the same training, and coming from money and having to struggle for so many years that, you know, when he finally did something that he really felt was great, he was accused of it being too good. You know what I mean? And so, you know, working in his little bubble, which we're all kind of working in our bubbles now, and, you know, having these open studio or open critiques where other artists would come to him for his advice and his feedback, I think it probably helped him to feel like he was worthy, maybe.
Did you read that in the book? Did you find things in the book that gave you that impression?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anything else about Rodin for the second?
I wanted to just agree with Christy, because there was a point when he opened up his studio and all these people were coming, and he felt it as an affirmation because he had left school and didn't feel particularly successful. So he did have affirmations, and Joey talked about he made his own pavilion during the World's Fair that he ended up moving to his farm, and that he sold hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he did commercialize on his success, and he did a really good job of it. So just some points that impressed me about Rodin. I also, like Judy, went to the museum when I was in Paris many years ago and was extraordinarily impressed by his beautiful work.
Yeah, in person, it's, you know, I just encourage everyone to find one of his big pieces and look at it and walk around it and imagine touching it with your eyes. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so Rilke was named René Maria Rilke. He changed his name later to Reiner. And
I was wondering if that's how you said that.
yeah,
Yeah.
because he didn't want to have a girly name. You know, he was small. He was sickly much of his life, and he was a sort of brooding, doubting poet. Almost the opposite of Rodin in a way, physically, and you know, and the impression we get of their attitude toward the world. So here are some pictures of him with Rodin. Yep, that's Rodin on the left and Rilke on the right. Some people called him a mouse. Looks like a mouse. And
there
then,
was an excerpt in the book, Judy, about his mother dressing him like a little girl because of the lost girl baby that she had prior to him. So
that's right. For
we had a
quite
chip
a
on
while.
his shoulder about that.
Yes, I think while he was even into elementary school. Isn't that right, Joey?
I think until he was sent to military school, his mom more or less raised him as a girl, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to think about whether that suited his temperament. It certainly didn't suit his ability to get along with other kids. You know, he was really picked on. But later on in the book, you know, he's always searching for his master or his mentor or his guide who will sort of save him spiritually. And so I wonder if dressing him as a girl was kind of like her way of recognizing that. No, she just dressed him as a girl because she wanted to do that. But anyway, it's interesting to think about what influences.
He clearly resented his mother for it. I mean, he
did. Well,
he was resenting his mother all the time.
I know. Well, he got beat up all the time, you know, and made fun of. So, all right. So that's Rodin and Rilke. I'm sorry, these pictures are so small in the lower left-hand corner. And then Lou Andreas Salome was a figure in this book who was an important, extremely important person in Rilke's life and in Freud's life and Nietzsche's life. She's fascinating to read about. I really recommend, you know, looking at the books about her. And she wrote a book about Nietzsche that's really wonderfully done too. She was Rilke's lover and lifelong friend, but they had a break for a while. And then she basically said to him, you can come back to me in your direst hour. And he did at one time, and that he did when he hit that point, and they were friends forever after that. Down below is a picture of Rilke. What's his wife's name?
Westhoff, Clara.
Clara.
Westhoff. And
that's not her.
No, that's not her though. This is Balthus's mother. Who is that, Joey?
I have to look at her.
Is it Baladine Klazawska? I can't pronounce it, but a young Balthus and Baladine.
Yeah, her name was Baladine.
Oh yeah, that's it. So Balthazar is the youngster in the middle, and Balthazar ended up becoming a very controversial, provocative, and incredible painter. Okay, Christy, how about a poem? Okay, I'm going to read this in case it's too hard to see. This is called The Panther. Both Rodin and Rilke spent time at animal zoos. His vision from the constantly passing bars has grown so weary that it cannot hold anything else. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars, no world. As he paces in cramped circles over and over, the movement of his powerful, soft strides is like a ritual dance around a center in which a mighty will stands paralyzed. Only at times the curtain of the pupils lifts quietly. An image enters in, rushes down through the tensed, arrested muscles, plunges into the heart, and is gone. Impressions?
Heartbreaking.
Yes, how so?
You really, as I read this and read it, as he paces cramped circles over and over again. We've all seen cats in cages in zoos. And he just seems completely restricted.
I think that he really captures the angst of a caged animal, and how they must be the majesty of the panther, yet the forced restraint. I think it's beautiful, very clear for me.
Heartbreaking. 1,000 bars, and behind the bars, no world.
I love that image, because if you're an animal and you're just walking back and forth, all you see is bars and bars and bars and bars, even though there may only be 20. There's thousands.
Rilke spent, I learned from the book, it was fascinating. He spent a lot of time in zoos and observing things outdoors so that he learned to see inside. Sort of, I forget what they call it, the
Inseeing.
Yes, that whole concept of looking beyond what you see. And of course, that is very much comes out in this poem. But I was fascinated by that, by that she describes in the book, and that he became really good at doing that. But you don't just learn how to do that by going out and saying, well, I'm going to pretend that I'm inside this caged animal. I mean, you have to practice it over and over again before it becomes how you see things. And that's what Rilke spent a lot of time doing.
Well, it had to do a lot with advances in psychology and studying sort of the human mind, and, you know, this new idea in the 19th century of empathy, and being able to put yourself in the shoes of someone else to really sort of imagine what the world is like for others, and to gain a broader understanding of what it's like to live in the world. And I was, like you, Christina, completely fascinated with these images that and experiences that he had, not only by putting himself in the shoes of an animal, but also by sort of following people on his walks through, you know, Paris or other places, and sort of losing himself in that experience, that empathetic experience, and then writing about it to others to such a detailed extent that they could then feel that they were in that person's shoes as well. I found that to be just really fascinating.
Exactly.
Yeah, before this, I think it was all about the retina. It was, you know, what you looked at is what you saw. It was perceptual. And then along came Freud and consciousness and the unconscious and the idea of empathy, all sort of happened in the same general time. It was pretty amazing.
And I think we see that in the Balzac's, you know, Rodin's work at Balzac, that he's gotten into the inner sense of Balzac in the way in which he's physically presented him. The way the words, you know, for Rilke say the same thing.
Yeah.
I have a question for anyone, and Judy, you're a writer. How does this stuff translate? He wrote in German in the beginning of his career, then in French. And I just wondered to myself, when something like this is translated into English, I think this poem's pretty powerful, but I wonder how it, you know, is it the same? Does the translation do it justice? Is it even better in German, as I imagine this one was written in German?
That's a whole, I mean, translation studies, it's a whole, a whole huge subject, and I have read a number of things in translation with different translations, and others of you, I'm sure, have done the same thing. And I develop preferences for a certain translator, but there are a lot of choices to be made. I mean, they have to decide how much to adhere to the rhythms and the rhymes and the sounds and or if they're going to, focus on particular meanings or images. There's a guy named Pierre Jolis, Joris, Joris, I'm corrected here, who translated Paul Celan's work. And Joris has written a lot and has videos about words in German that literally cannot be translated into English because the German contains so many different meanings, and the English is very spare compared to the meanings in the German. So I don't read German. I would love to read this in German. And I would say that Rilke is somebody to read in the original if you speak the language and compare it.
He also translated, I remember in the book, I think it was this book, he was doing some translation work himself, wasn't he?
Yes, he translated for others, and he did some translation of his own work. And later on, he hated the language of German, the sound. So he wrote in French.
So Tim has put over in the chat some of the factors that can cause a translated text to be inaccurate when compared to the original text. And thank you for doing that, Tim. Wow. It's a lot. And it makes you think about, especially with poetry, I mean, the rhythm, the sounds, the way that words work together or play off of each other are part of poetry. Poetry is incredibly complicated, and it's complicated to translate prose, but I mean, it's unbelievable when people translate poetry and do it well.
Yeah, I tend to think that the Panther is deeper, has more reverberation than we're seeing in it at first glance. Maybe because it's translated into English, but this last stanza, only at times the curtain of the pupils lifts quietly, an image enters in. I wonder if Rilke is writing about the poet there, writing about himself, looking at the Panther as well as the Panther looking outside through the bars, because an image is entering in both of their pupils. And there's this thing about empathy and Rilke's, intention to see beyond the surface, to see in and, be in the shoes of the other.
Well, I mean, he kind of gives you that clue because he talks about arrested muscles. So muscles at rest, rather than he's talking about the panther who's stalking around the cage, right? So it does sort of indicate that he's switching who he's talking about maybe back to himself rather than talking about the panther.
Yeah, I think arrested muscles is interesting because arrested, they're stopped and they're frozen at the same time it suggests at rest, that word, that particular word. So, I would love to know what arrested muscles, how that's actually in the original, how that, what.
Yeah, but it's prefaced by tensed. So you've got this dichotomy of muscle experience.
Right. So yeah, arrested is more like something has been stopped rather than it's at rest.
Yes, but it still suggests rest because it has rest in that word. Just from a poet's standpoint, that's going to be something intentional.
Back and forth. Yeah.
Otherwise,
I thought that word is maybe almost like the word atrophy or rest or muscles that are not allowed to do what they're supposed to do.
Right.
It's
Frozen.
It's frozen. It's addressing the fact that the poor panther is just pacing and not running and enjoying his body, his muscles. That's the impression I feel from that.
His potential.
his potential. Yes. So his arrested muscles, because he can't use them in his environment.
So here he could have written rushes down through the tensed muscles, but he stuck this word arrested in, which is causing us to have all these different ideas about what's going on. And then it plunges. The image then plunges. So the image is stopped right there. And we have to grapple with that image. And then it plunges into the heart and is gone.
So Tim, I think you also pointed out, I wish you could unmute yourself, Tim. Your feedback is always so great, that Stephen Mitchell is a contemporary translator, not a contemporary of Rilke. So, you know, language and its use across time and space is also one of those things that makes translation difficult, because a word could have been used differently at the time it was written or have different connotations than it does now. So.
Yeah, that's great, Tim. And Tim, you made another comment about Rodin that I want to read when we get back to Rodin. Do we have another poem? Is there another poem or something by Rilke? Oh yeah. So Rilke, correct me if I am misremembering this, but I think Rilke met Rodin because he wanted to do a monograph. He was commissioned to do a monograph in a series of monographs about artists. Rilke was commissioned to do one on Rodin. And so he wrote Rodin asking, to meet, and if he could, and he wanted to get photographs for the book.
And reminding Rodin that his wife, Rilke's wife, had been one of his students.
Yes, that's right. So, so this is the Cry is Rodin's sculpture here. Amazing. And here is the poem that Rilke wrote. Oh my God, I'm having trouble seeing this. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angelic orders? And even if one were to suddenly take me to its heart, I would vanish into its stronger existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror. That we are still able to bear, and we revere it so, because it calmly disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terror. Beauty. So I guess I have a question about beauty, which I was thinking about when I was reading this book. Do you have a sense of the similar or different notions that Rodin and Rilke have about beauty? What does beauty mean to the two of them? Any ideas?
Well, it doesn't seem that Rilke has a very high opinion of beauty. Beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, and we revere it because it calmly disdains to destroy us. Like beauty is, our downfall, is how I read that.
So I had found a paragraph from the book that talks about Bibi, the Greek handyman, whom Rodin used as a model, and Bibi had a broken nose and was disfigured. And I'll just read the paragraph. It said, Bibi had taught Rodin that beauty was about truth, not perfection. There's nothing ugly in art except that which is without character, he would conclude. The human being, flawed creature that he is, cannot relate to perfection, but people can empathize with scars, wrinkles, and lines, which together add up to the semblance of a lifetime. And it made me think about other artists that I like, and Caravaggio came to mind because he painted these sort of, religious figures and spiritual figures using street people and imperfect people, and that was beauty. So I don't know, that impressed me, that he thought, it wasn't a Botox world.
Thank you, Sandy, for that. Yeah, I was thinking of Bibi too. So Rodin couldn't afford to hire models, and he went to medical facilities, and he, he looked at diseased organs and very distorted, unhealthy pieces of the human body. And then he met this guy Bibi, and at first he found Bibi incredibly ugly, but he had to take what he could get, because he was doing sculptures of people. And as he closely looked at every little piece of Bibi's face, as Rodin would, he began to see the truth of Bibi, and therefore the beauty of Bibi. And I think in a way, there's a little of that in Rilke here, because because beauty is, it calmly disdains to destroy us. It's a bit objective. Beauty doesn't make itself known in the superficial or in the obvious, or it does sometimes, but that's not real true.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder?
Well, what do you think? What do you think about that? Who is that? Who's speaking?
Billy.
Billy, I'm sorry. Billy without video.
Okay.
Well, that beauty is in, and that's what I thought of in reading the book when I read that part, that, the more he saw Bibi and the more he worked, the more he could appreciate what was there, and not just look for what should be beautiful. So we have, there's a lot of conversation in contemporary society right now about what is beauty and what is, is the norm, and how you break past that norm.
Yeah, anyone else have an idea about that? Want to say something?
Back to Rilke, reading this, I'm thinking back to his conflict with his wife and his lover partners, that was beauty, but it also kept him from, the terror was it kept him from doing his work, which he was so eager to do. So that's what when I read that, I thought about all those passages in there where he was really conflicted about his love life versus his work.
Yeah, and back to Rodin, I think that in the book it was emphasized that Rilke took from Rodin that edict to work, just work, Rodin kept saying. And for Rodin, that meant you have a house, you have a family, you have a life. For Rilke, it meant he had to give up those things. He tried to have those things, but he didn't seem very able, was my impression. Correct me. I mean, please disagree if you do. That Rilke had to throw himself into his work sort of exclusively, and needed extreme solitude at times to be able to produce work. And it was very destructive for him. Do you know the different ways that these artists worked? Were they similar, or were they different in their process? Do you remember?
I feel like Rodin surrounded himself with assistants who did a lot of the physical labor, and hangers-on and admirers and people who wanted his opinion. Whereas Rilke, I feel like he could be easily distracted. He needed to be completely isolated from the world, shut up in his apartment, without sounds going on around him. There were descriptions in the book of, his neighbors, he would have to move because his neighbors were, making too much noise or going through their own life, issues. And so I think that they actually maybe had completely different ways of working.
Yeah, Rodin also, he spent years and years and years. He never finished The Gates of Hell. He was working on that his whole life. He never finished it. He was always changing it. And Rilke, it seemed, would had bursts of making. You know, he would need solitude and all of this, and he'd go here and go there. And then all of a sudden, sometimes in the worst of his circumstances, he would just write a book. Who do you have more sympathy for? This is a curiosity question. Rodin or Rilke?
I personally, I didn't know very much about Rilke before I read this book. I personally had a hard time understanding his selfish way of living. I mean, he had so many issues. He was so not, he had to be so self-centered in order to produce anything. And, you know, he often was destitute and didn't have any money. And, you know, he could not handle life, real life, like most people. And he had to, but he had this whole creative side and he was determined to do this. It was hard for me to feel sympathetic or to really understand his character. Whereas Rodin, I felt more, you know, as Christy said, he surrounded himself with people. He was kind of a businessman in a way because he was marketing a lot. I mean, there were multiple copies of his sculptures that were made. He had workmen all around. You know, he did have money. I mean, his personal relationships were not fantastic, but he managed to hold on to the same woman all his life, even though he was a womanizer in between. I don't know. I felt it harder to relate to the true. Rilke had this image of what the true creative artist was, and the true creative artist to him was just to, you know, not interacting with anything or any reality of life around you, but just listening to yourself. I don't know. I have trouble with that narcissistic viewpoint.
Is this
anybody else thought that?
Yeah, anyone else? I want to talk about empathy before we're finished.
I would say that, you know, like we were talking about earlier about psychology and understanding personalities, etc. It's like today we have so much more breadth of understanding of, or the possibility of understanding. And I would say that, you know, we don't know his actual mental state. We don't know if he was maybe high on the spectrum. And so for me, I think that my empathy vote goes toward Rilke, because my own personal experience during the pandemic, I'm an introverted extrovert. And people who know me would never think that I could be in my own bubble and comfortable. And so I'm relating that to him. And in order for him to be able to express his artistic impulses, that was the healthiest and best way he knew how at that time. And how difficult it must have been, because back in those days, artists really needed patrons to sustain their life unless they had, you know, accomplished some sense of fashionability and accolade.
Penny had her hand up.
Who, Penny?
Penny.
Unmute yourself, Penny.
There you go.
There you go.
I was reflecting on the visual versus the tactical. So we have Rodin, who was about form and substance. And Rilke, who is so, I would go as far as to say spiritual, a very deep person, because that's how I experience Rilke's poetry. So it's a different skill set, I guess. And so the fact that they could get together, and I didn't read this book, but I thought that was part of what was going to be happening. I just thought that concept was just amazing, that they would bring two very different skill sets to the creative process, and that they would be friends because of it.
I have a question about the book itself. Thank you. It portrays Rilke as weak, sickly, driven, intense. He was secular, but he was always looking for the higher force, thinking about death and all of that. And Rodin seems to be, hearing you guys talk about it, him more functional, competent in the world, sort of. Is this a stereotype that this author has taken on? I mean, I think it's terrific that he has chosen these two people who did meet and did spend time together, and whose work, interwove in different ways in books and whatnot. But I'm also struck by the idea that this might also have been a chance to play into the stereotype of the dysfunctional, dreamy poet and the powerful sculptor of bronze. Did any of the rest of you get that?
A dysfunctional word.
I'm sorry.
Why would you see him as dysfunctional?
As dysfunctional? Dysfunctional in the world in that he really couldn't, he had difficulty with relationships, and he had difficulty being with someone. At one point, he did get a wife and he got a house, and he thought, wow, I'm normal. I'm an ordinary person. I can really get to my work now. And it didn't work for him. He wasn't able to work while he was living a quote normal life. That's all I mean by dysfunctional. Dysfunctional in the way we kind of think about it now, I suppose.
Hello.
Hi, Mark. Anthony.
Hi. Sorry. I hope everyone could hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Awesome. So I have like stage fright now that I'm here.
Close your eyes.
I can still hear you all. Can you repeat the question just so I could just really have it in mind?
Yeah. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the author of this book taking an opportunity to set out stereotypes that society kind of might have about different artists. And the stereotypes being, to my mind, sort of the weak, dreamy, self-centered, head in the clouds, hearing voices, half mad, dysfunctional poet, and the powerful, strong man who makes bronze and casts and does these monumental figures.
Right. I think the author does a great job of exemplifying the psychic powers of Rilke, and how his strength really relied on his ability to be able to see past like the veneer of physical experience, and use that kind of as a harness to enter the spiritual like embodiment of what he was looking at. I remember there was a scene in the book where I think he saw somebody who was disabled, and he was shocked. Like his mind ran off with him, and he had to go back home. And as being a sensitive person myself, and like suffering from like panic disorder, I could understand how something that could trigger you all of a sudden, and then you go back, then you have to kind of recede. And it makes me think of Emily Dickinson and how during the time after, when the biographers were finally like writing down what she was like, they kind of painted her as this recluse, very weak. And then now today in modern scholarship, we find out that she was actually the complete opposite of what people really got from the impressions that were left by early biographers. And Rodin as well in the book, although he is stereotyped as just a man that's just busy with his work constantly, he always has to have his hands in his work, kind of like Cézanne, really have that solid work ethic where all they see is their next project. Rilke, the author introduces a point of like reflection, Rilke, where he says, like, I can't believe Rodin never thought that he was going to die. Yeah. Like, you know, like after all this time, you would think that he would recognize that he was going to die. And then towards the end of his life, after his wife dies, or after Rose dies, he's like, I'm going to be alone. Like I'm alone. And I think Rose was fully aware of that weakness within him, although he was always involved, although he was always mentally strong and like physically robust, that there was that childish tenderness that you know, when a child looks at you and realizes that one day you will die and one day they will die, that's the consequence. He kind of never made that jump that he was going to pass as well. He was just so focused on his work.
Yeah.
So I think it does contribute to the stereotype, but it also does a good job, and because ultimately it's characterizations of the two men. We'll never get to know them personally. I think it does a great job of presenting contrasting views on their strengths and weaknesses.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thanks for getting over your stage fright.
Thank you.
And what you describe about yourself and about Rilke is real empathy. And we didn't get to empathy, but empathy is a big thing in this book. Both of the artists, I think, were very empathetic in how they did their art. Rilke had great empathy for other people and needed other people in his life. And Rodin had incredible empathy for his material. You know, and at the end, although Rilke was writing about spirituality and death and the terror of beauty, because beauty is the truth and all this stuff, you know, in the end, Rilke was like, yeah, I'm going to die. Yeah. And Rodin was just horrified at aging, and had a very difficult time at the end. It's interesting.
So over in the chat, Tim says, I think both of them were vulnerable to their own lack of clarity of direction. So we all are when we are pushing the limits of our own work or ideas. And Barbara P says, I thought of it as a study of two artists in the same time who learned different views of the world rather than stereotypes.
Great.
And Judy, I wanted to speak to your point about empathy. And empathy in particular in Rodin's work. In the book, Robert Browning's son had taken lessons from Rodin, right. And he was so impressed by his son's work that he commented on Rodin, and he said, like Rembrandt, Rodin makes misery live and finds beauty and poetry even in age-bowed facts.
Nice. Yeah.
And also, if I could comment on poets too, I think even fairly contemporary poets, again, Judy, to what you said about the how people view poets, I think about Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell, and these poets whose lives almost supersede and bury their work in some ways. You know, the tortured poet. So I think it's easy to do that.
Yes, it is easy to do that. But it's great that in this book also he pressed through that. And I think Rilke might have started out to some as sort of a pathetic disciple, but ended up really having been willing to go through, you know, the demons he had to confront in the world and in his mind, to find the poetry that he meant to find. When he realized there's no reward at the end, but you have to write what you have to write. And he did. Does anyone else want to say anything? I think are we coming to the end, Christy?
Yeah, we're a little bit over time, and unfortunately I have another meeting to go to, so we can't go too long today. But does anybody have any last thoughts or impressions of the book that they'd like to share? I really enjoyed her language, actually. I loved the way that she sort of, the author interwove the two stories of these two very different individuals who I think figure large in people's imaginations, and seeing the way that they came together. I had no idea that they actually were, you know, had these shared experiences and shared history together. So there were beautiful moments where she turned a phrase really in a really lovely way that I appreciated.
I agree. There are gorgeous passages. I marked a whole bunch of them, you know, to read, just to read aloud to myself, you know, in the chat. So Joey is reminding us there were a lot of other people other than Rilke and Rodin in this book, and many of them were women, and many of the women were very accomplished. So Joey is saying, take a look at some of the artwork of Rilke's wife, Clara Westhoff, and his friend, Paula Modersohn Becker. It is really powerful and beautiful. And
don't forget Camille Claudel, Joey.
Camille. And there's a movie about Camille
it's a beautiful, beautiful film.
It's great to watch. Carol said the dilemma of being in the world and being of the world. Rilke is struggling with the inner world. Rodin, the struggle was with the outer world. Yeah. And Tim, well, I'm reading back on some of what you have said. And it's, did you read this? I think both of them were vulnerable to their own lack of clarity of direction.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, Tim, get your audio fixed because I want to hear more about what you. Anybody else have anything to say in closing? This has been wonderful.
And so Michelle had asked about the film. As I recall, Michelle, it's just called Camille Claudel, and it's from maybe the late 80s, early 90s. It's Gerard Depardieu plays Rodin, and Isabella Gianni plays Camille Claudel. And they're beautifully cast.
Okay, I think I saw it because I love his work. So I'm 80s, I'm sure I saw it.
Yeah, you might not like him that much after you watch the movie.
May not.
But at any rate, thank you, Judy. Thank you to all of you for coming. I always love reading the book and then finding out what y'all's insights are, because I feel like every month we all get different things from the book selections, and I really did enjoy this one. Some biographies, and Tim, I know you're not the biggest fan of biographies. I would love to hear, you know, what your thoughts are on this book, but I thought that this was a really interesting way to present two very different people together. Next month we are venturing back into fiction. We do fiction maybe twice a year or so. And next month's book is Susan Vreeland's Clara and Mr. Tiffany, a novel. And that discussion will be led by Barbara Pressman, who's on today, one of our touring docents as well, who suggested the book and volunteered to moderate. So thank you. Within the next couple of weeks, we'll probably announce several of our upcoming book choices into the winter and spring. So keep an eye on that. When I send you all the email announcement for next month, I'll make sure to link to the upcoming choices that we have as well. So if you'd like to get those books and get a head start on reading, you can. I hope everybody has a great rest of your week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Take care. Thanks again, Judy.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.